How you doing? You're very, very welcome to Tras na Tíre. My name is Marcus Howard of Histories and Stories, and we're a collective of passionate historians who aren't going to let a virus get in the way of us remembering our great Irish history. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the flying columns of the IRA and guerrilla warfare during the War of Independence with Dalton. This lecture scratches beneath the surface of the romantic image of the flying column and looks a little bit closer at how the IRA reacted to the demands of an intensified guerrilla war. The talk looks at the column in action, its effectiveness, and otherwise as a fighting force, its place within the IRA's structure, and the network of activists and sympathisers it required to remain in the field. So our speaker tonight, Dalton, has a BA Honours in English and History from Carlow College, and also has a Master's in Philosophy in Modern Irish History first from Trinity College in Dublin. Des, you're very, very welcome tonight to Tras na Tíre.
Thanks, Marcus. So, you're happy for me to kick off?
Fire away.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, just to thank Tras na Tíre for giving me the opportunity to present here tonight, and I hope I can do the subject some justice. I suppose the first thing I would say about the flying columns, as Marcus just alluded to there, there's something that have acquired somewhat of a romantic image. For many, the trench coat, bandoliered and gator IRA Volunteer personifies that whole period in revolutionary history, and I think that's seen. It's probably epitomised, if you like, in the famous Sean Keating Men of the South portrait. In many ways, that kind of reinforces that whole image. The heroic column, was seen as emerging from the hills to take on the forces of the British Empire and so on, and facing down the Tans and the infamous auxiliaries and so on, and then disappearing back into the mists of the Irish hills as quickly as it emerged. And all of this kind of romantic idea of the column became very much, I think for a lot of people, when they think of the IRA of that period, that's often the first image that would come to mind. So I suppose what I'm trying to do tonight is to kind of, as Marcus said there, to try and kind of dig a little bit beneath the surface there and get a little bit more into the reality of what the column was, and also looking a little bit at the origin of the columns, and as I said, its effectiveness and so on, and also looking at the structure and the network that existed around the columns, and what was required to keep an active column in the field, and that would involve obviously the role of people like Cumann na Món and so on, and the wider network of supporters and sympathisers that existed in the general area and within the countryside. I'd also be briefly looking at and examining the role of the column and that it played in legitimising the IRA as an army of a legitimate government, rather than the quote-unquote rabble army that was often depicted in official British Army histories of the conflict. So to begin with, I'm just going to kind of briefly look at the origin of the column and of the flying column, and that in itself is somewhat a matter of contention as well. In Limerick's fighting story and in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, Donnacha O'Hannigan claimed that the idea was formulated by him and others in East Limerick, in the East Limerick Brigade area. He claims that it was the first attempt for several centuries, and to quote him, to provide the nucleus of an Irish standing army, unquote. According to O'Hannigan, following the attack in Kilmallock Barracks on May the 28th, 1920, the names of 14 volunteers were posted by the RIC as wanted for complicity in the quote-unquote murder of police. And he said that following this posting of these names, it forced those volunteers to go on the run. He claims that this and a journey taken by himself and Patrick Clancy, who was commandant of the East Limerick Brigade, following the funeral of Liam Scully, who was killed in that attack in Kilmallock Barracks, and that on that journey across country, that it convinced him of the effectiveness and mobility that could be afforded to an organised unit of armed volunteers. He's supported in his contention by, among others, Tomás Malone, and also by Ernie O'Malley, actually, on Another Man's Wound, also talks about the origins of the column lying in the formation of flying column lying in the East Limerick area. However, it's disputed by Daniel O'Shaughnessy, a member of the Kilfinane company of the IRA, in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, where he said it was merely a spontaneous attempt to obtain arms in the Cush area, which brought together volunteers from the Cush and Kilfinane companies, independent of O'Hannigan. This idea that it was an organic development brought about by the demands of immediate action and the immediate situation is also the contention of Michael Brennan, who was the OC of the Mid-Clare Brigade. And in his memoir, The War in Clare, he supports O'Shaughnessy's contention that the idea of the flying column was, and I quote, a purely spontaneous idea that arose from the prevailing conditions, unquote. Brennan argued that volunteers forced to go on the run found safety in numbers, as well as it being easy to billet and guard a group of men together, spread out over such a wide area. In terms of numbers, the optimum number that could be fed and billeted at any one time was 20, and this could be supplemented from the local battalion area if required for an operation. Thomas Toomey, in his history of the Tan War in Limerick, comes down on the side of O'Hannigan's account. Whilst he doesn't rule out the local development of active service units, he argues that the more wide-ranging vision for the use of a column comes from O'Hannigan and Clancy. And he supports this by pointing out that Paddy Clancy was soon after tasked with establishing a column in North Cork by Liam Lynch. Whatever the truth of the formation of the first flying column or columns, the GHQ of the Irish Republican Army soon saw their merit in the idea, and in late August recommended all brigade areas to establish columns. And these were first established in areas where there was sufficient number of volunteers on their own, and later in less active areas. And actually, again, in August of 1920, another development was the passing by the British of the British government of the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, which was a supplement to the Defence of the Realm Act, the Draconian Dora Act, and the sweeping powers of arrest and detention that this act gave the RIC and the British military. Also, another one of the unintended consequences of it was, again, to force a lot of active IRA volunteers on their own. And again, that again fed into the creation of what was a full-time army, and led to again fed into the development of these what were effectively columns, flying columns. Actually, and also the reference to Liam Lynch is quite interesting, because North Cork, I think, is actually in many respects, I would argue, probably even more fundamental to the formation of the column, because what was developed by Lynch in the North Cork area was probably one of the most effective developments there. And Lynch's idea of, again, was similar to O'Hannigan. It was to bring together the most effective, the most active volunteers and putting them on a standing basis. And his idea was that within a brigade, that each battalion actually would have a core active service unit or column, which would not necessarily be on full-time active service, but would be on call. And depending on the size of the operation and so on, a number of these active service units could be brought together. And Lynch's idea was that this would spread the activity in as wide a possible area across the brigade, the entire brigade area, and it would also to maximise the supports that were required and the general logistics and so on that were required in supporting a group of active men in the field. So I think the North Cork area is, to me, I would argue, probably the key area in terms of development of the column. The column's place in the overall IRA structure is also worth looking at. And according to John Borgonovo, the IRA basically applied a parish by parish organisation onto a British Army structure of companies, battalions, brigades and divisions. Nominally, it was controlled by a GHQ staff comprising of a chief of staff, under whom there were 10 directors of departments such as organisation, training, publicity, engineering, etc. However, GHQ offered encouragement and some amount of cohesion to the underground army using its journal An Tóglacht to provide its various units of organisation news from the centre. Some senior officers were determined to turn the IRA from a guerrilla army into a conventional one, thus depriving it of its core advantage. For example, Richard Mulcahy sought minute organisational detail from local units, with the result that when his office was captured by British forces, it gave the British an insight into the inner workings of the IRA that had previously been denied to them. The reality was that brigades and in many cases local battalions maintained a large amount of autonomy over their own areas, with little oversight from GHQ. However, if the provincial units largely had freedom of action within their respective areas, they also had to fund and arm themselves. Excuse me. Volunteers paid a small weekly fee, meaning that the IRA was an army whose soldiers paid to serve in it. To fund, for example, lack of arms. Many brigades levied, quote unquote, the community, often using established rates, a tax-based and property valuations. Michael Brennan recounts a church gate collections being taken up in his area, which raised £1,500 at the time, which was quite a significant sum at the time. Borgonovo said that while it was not popular with property owners, it placed a manageable burden on those most able to afford it. Refusal to pay a levy could result in the IRA seizing cattle or other property. Flying column was an expression of this autonomy of action and fitted perfectly into the structure of a guerrilla army. Despite the flying columns remaining one of the dominant images in the collective memory of the 1919-23 period, service in a column was atypical of the ordinary volunteer experience. The majority of volunteers, even the most active, would have taken part in only a handful of armed engagements, and many volunteers would never have held a loaded gun. In some cases, the flying column was out of touch with its own HQ. For example, in March 1921, when the OC of the 7th Battalion of the Kilkenny Brigade needed to be replaced, Ned Aylward assumed command of the battalion and its flying column with the unanimous consent of its members. In effect, the West Kilkenny Flying Column was a freelance unit, carrying on without specific orders from the Kilkenny Brigade. It was a month or more before Aylward's position was formally ratified by Ernie O'Malley and Con Maloney, representing the newly formed 2nd Southern Division staff. And interestingly, Borgonovo makes the case that the lack of arms in 1921, the IRA had 3,000 rifles, nearly all captured British forces, provided an advantage, however inadvertent. The lack of arms made the IRA choose its targets carefully, and this required tight discipline and careful planning. According to Borgonovo, to quote him, cautious IRA guerrillas only fought when they could win and retreated without hesitation when threatened. Their mantra of living to fight another day made them a very difficult foe to fight, unquote. And this again feeds into what Tom Barry would have had to say about the effectiveness of a flying column. And according to Barry, the most effective and the most important function of a column was just to exist. And he writes in Guerrilla Days in Ireland, his famous tome on the legendary account of his activities and the activities of the West Cork Brigade Flying Column during the Tan War. He writes there that the very existence of such a column of armed men, even if it never struck a blow, was a continuous challenge to the enemy and forced him to maintain large garrisons to meet the threatened onslaught on his military forces and for the security of his civil administration. Such a column moving around must seriously affect the morale of garrisons, for one day it would surely strike. It also maintained the highest expression of our nationhood, the flying column of the army of the people, unquote. Maintaining and supporting the flying column in the field required wider organisation, and again, this is why I think an examination of the flying columns is so important, because it feeds into so many other aspects of the IRA structure, and indeed the structure of the wider national movement. Billets and safe houses were required. A column could not survive in an area without the goodwill and support of the bulk of the populace. This is evidenced by the many accounts of columns arriving to find families giving up their beds, and in many cases food, to tired, cold and hungry volunteers after possibly marching all night. Local doctors in many cases provided medical services to the column and attended wounded volunteers. And local columns would, in many cases, provide wider support, while a column rested local columns or local companies provided lookouts and local reconnaissance, etc. Cumann played a key role in supporting the columns, and it is a role that has all too frequently been overlooked. Although thankfully, I think in recent years, I think that's been redressed, and particularly I think with the emergence from the archives of particularly things like the pension records and so on, I think the role of local Cumann people is beginning to come more and more into the limelight. A column or an active service unit would appear, according to the military service pension records, to have had members of Cumann who were directly attached to active service units and columns. Their principal activities were in communications. They relayed messages and directives between the column and brigade or battalion staff and vice versa. The gathering of intelligence and the transport of arms were other key tasks performed by Cumann. And they also supplied first aid and assistance for wounded members of the column, and in a number of cases provided field dressing stations and so on, adjacent to barrack attacks and adjacent to planned ambushes. Another interesting aspect of the column activities reflected the wider crossover of political and military roles played by senior IRA members, who in many cases were also public representatives or had other key roles within the civil government of Dáil Éireann. Tomás Malone, for instance, said that sometimes he combined his military duties with the East Limerick column with Dáil loan business. Michael Brennan provides an account of how the Mid-Clare column secured the premises for Clare County Council to meet and provide security for it. As the councils withheld payment of rates, etc., to the British administration, their meetings became a target for the British military and police, and Brennan himself was a member of the council representing Sinn Féin. As a fighting force, the columns proved to be particularly effective. O'Hannigan described them as the spearhead of the IRA. As the spearhead of the IRA, and it was also in Munster, notable columns were the East Limerick Brigade column. Despite operating in terrain that was not supportive of guerrilla action, it was very active. It also operated in the North Cork area, which I've already alluded to there, and where it worked in cooperation with the North Cork Brigade area flying column under Liam Lynch. One of its most successful actions was at Drumkeen, where it took on 2 lorry loads of Black and Tans and regular RIC. The West Cork Brigade flying column is perhaps the most famous and one of the most active. Its actions at Kilmichael, Rosscarbery Barracks attack, and Crossbarry, to name but some of the most notable actions carried out by the West Cork, the third West Cork Brigade flying column, and indeed Crossbarry obviously is notable as the only pitched battle fought by the IRA against regular British military forces in the Tan War. In Tipperary, the 3rd Brigade column under Dinny Lacey was also very effective, and with successful actions in Thomastown and Clogheen, which resulted in the capture of an RIC inspector. In Leinster, the West Kilkenny column cooperated closely with the said named 3rd Tipperary column. The North Longford column under Sean McKeown and Tom Brady was another effective unit, with one of his most famous actions being the Clonfin ambush. In Connacht, the South Mayo Brigade column under the command of Tom Maguire fought a running battle against Black and Tans and regular British soldiers at Tourmakeedy. Despite overwhelming odds, they managed to hold off the British forces and got their seriously wounded OC, Tom Maguire, safely away. Charlie Daly was sent by GHQ staff into Ulster, and Charlie Daly was in Kerry, and he was sent up as an organiser into Tyrone, where he also organised quite an effective column operating in there. And it's one of the lesser known columns of the Tan War period, but nonetheless one of the more effective ones, and he worked there with people like Ona Duffy and others as part of the 2nd Northern Division area. The West Mayo column under Michael Kilroy fought several major engagements with British forces, and one of its most successful being the Carrow Kennedy ambush. So as you can see from that, over quite a wide area of the country, by mid 1921, by the spring of 1921, there have been quite a number of very effective columns organised, and I've just named some there. There are many others, where the IRA was developing a much more professional and much more cohesive fighting, becoming a much more effective and cohesive fighting force on the ground. And this was reflected by the increasing use of regular British military in combating them. Sir Ormond Winter, Dublin Castle's chief of intelligence, referred to the IRA leadership as, and I quote, coming from the low and degenerate type, unequipped with intellectual education, unquote. And again, talking about the legitimization of the IRA and of the wider struggle. What was at work here was, this was an attempt by the British administration to, if you like, to delegitimize the IRA and to kind of deny it a legitimacy, and by doing so, by extension, to delegitimize the Dáil and so on, and everything else that came with it. And from this point of view, I think as well, I think it's important to look at the flying column as part of that attempt by the national movement of the Dáil, and by extension its army in the field, the IRA, to portray itself and to show itself as a regular army in the field. And I think this is another aspect I think that is probably less considered, unfortunately, of the flying columns. And I think it's an important area that needs to be looked at, the role of the flying columns in lending a legitimacy to the Dáil and to the concept of this being a new revolutionary state with an army in the field. Depicting the IRA as a rabble rather than the army of a democratically elected government was central, as I said, to this narrative that the British were trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to tell the world. For the IRA, their organisation, discipline and conduct of the war were not just of military importance, were also part of this wider propaganda battle, as I've said. The flying columns were Ireland's standing full-time army. The many photographs that were taken of the various columns in full battle dress were a riposte to the British depiction of the IRA, because here was an army in the field with all the military bearing of a conventional army. They were claiming their own legitimacy, and I think that we've all seen those photographs, and I think they were an important propaganda tool. They were part of that, if you like, giving that visual image of this standing army, this regular army in the field. And as I say, it's an area that I think is definitely there's scope for further study there in fleshing out that role of the IRA. They were claiming their own legitimacy, and it's this depiction of the IRA Volunteer in heroic pose that not unsurprisingly was chosen when monuments were being erected to the IRA fallen of the 1916, 21 and indeed 23 period. It was an image that came to personify the Irish fight for freedom in this period, and importantly how it was viewed in the collective memory of so many of the Irish people. And it's going back again to the point I was making at the beginning, that for a lot of people, and I think it shows the effectiveness of that even in the present day, when people think about the War of Independence period and they think about the IRA, that's often the image that they get is of, say, for instance, a statue that's here depicted. I think that's the statue in Athlone to the Westmeath and Athlone Brigade area, dead of the 1916-21 period. That's the image that will stick in many people's minds. So I think from that point of view, it was also quite an effective propaganda tool as well in doing so. So I'm approaching the end of my talk here now. So what I just, to sum up then, to say was that the flying column would later be deployed during the subsequent Civil War, following a brief period of conventional war in the initial months. Notable columns at that period were in Wicklow, Neil Plunkett O'Boyle of Kincastle in County Donegal, following his escape from Newbridge internment camp. He formed a column in the Wicklow Mountains, which attracted a number of men that had escaped with him, and others that were on their own in the general areas. The members of that column actually came from quite a wide area across the country. There was people such as Tom Heavey from Mayo, as well as local volunteers, and it was actually quite an effective column. Tom Barry did likewise in Munster, as the IRA reverted to the tactics that had proved so successful against the British. However, now the conditions were greatly changed. The IRA were now facing an enemy led by men, many of whom had themselves mastered this war on the move during the Tan War. And this, along with their local knowledge and a lack of will within the population at large to sustain an ongoing war, made it impossible to operate with anything approaching the effectiveness that the columns enjoyed against the British. And indeed, if you just bear with me just for one moment, it kind of epitomizes that latter stage. And while my talk tonight has been about the War of Independence period, I kind of like to just kind of close off by briefly showing the demoralization that had set in at this latter stage and of the Civil War, and the column experience and the bitter experience that there was for the columns that were operating at this time. And it's actually just a brief quote here from a letter that was written by Charlie Daly, who I referred to earlier on, who had been sent by GHQ staff from Kerry up to Tyrone. And by the time of the Civil War, he'd actually transferred over to the 1st Northern Division area in Donegal. Charlie would subsequently be captured and was one of those that were executed at Drumbo. But in a letter written from captivity and actually dated on another quite a significant date, the 8th of December 1922, he writes about the experience of maintaining a column in the field in Donegal in the winter months of 1922. We had something over 100 men at the start, but most of them were very poor stuff. Word came that some of them were spies and traitors. In the course of a few weeks, we were left with only 30 men, and nearly all of them were strangers to the county. 'Twas that we got it in earnest. We could only keep it in the wildest and poorest houses, constantly on the move, over mountains and bogs, in all kinds of weather, and worse than all, with little or no local knowledge, local assistance, and very little sympathy. The few people that were on our side, though, were very loyal, but the action of the clergy told the most of them of these in the end. There were always more people on the lookout to betray us than were otherwise. The county is so accursedly poor that we could hardly get enough to eat. We were often glad when we could get potatoes and salt, or a bit of bread and a drop of tea. No matter what side their sympathies were with, they were always hospitable. Often and often we wanted to make a stand and have done with it in one decent scrap. So that kind of sums up the experience towards the end of the Civil War, in that midpoint of 1922, of someone like Charlie Daly, who had kind of seen the two sides of it, had seen the great success that it enjoyed in the Tan War period. And in many ways, it's quite a poignant and quite a sad ending, for many of those IRA volunteers who had soldiered all through that, what could be, I suppose, Frank Gallagher described as the 4 glorious years. So finally, and just very briefly, the legacy of the columns, and I suppose it could be said that at the beginning of Operation Harvest, the IRA's 1956 to 62 campaign, there was, I suppose, if you like, the final playing out of the idea of the column, when a number of columns were established as the kind of the lead attack forces of they were seen as the kind of the active service units, or kind of elite attacking forces of the IRA. And there was a number of columns set up, such as the Pierce column, the Teeling column, and so on. They came from particular geographical areas, the volunteers in them. And famously, the famous attack in Brookborough Barracks, in which Sean South and Fergal O'Hanlon were killed, were part of that. I think they were part of the Pierce column. They were, if you like, the last playing out of that idea of the flying column by the IRA. And again, their effectiveness was mixed, to say the least. And while they did allow for greater mobility against a stronger enemy, they suffered from a lack, a bit like Charlie Daly's experience there in the Civil War period, a lack of local knowledge and of the terrain in many cases, and a largely indifferent and sometimes hostile population. And also importantly, and this is where time had run out for the idea of the column in many respects, aerial reconnaissance had advanced considerably since the 1920s, and the days of the column had come to an end. So, if you like, the columns as an effective fighting force, to sum up, in the Tan War period, had served the purpose of allowing the IRA to maintain its men in the field, to coordinate its activities in the field and coordinate the various units of it, and the tying in of the various safe houses with Cumann and the other various auxiliary units that were used to support it. The flying column also, as I say, lent a legitimacy to the idea of the IRA as a regular fighting force in the field, and the idea of the Dáil maintaining its own army, rather than this disorganized rabble and so on that was being portrayed within by the British government and within the British press and so on. And also, as I said, there was the important link in with the civil arm, with things like protecting the local councils and maintaining, if you like, the administrative arm and reach of the Dáil and of the various local government departments and so on throughout the country. So on all of those levels, I think the flying column had a key role to play, and also as an effective fighting force. As I say, by the spring of 1921, it could be argued that in many areas, the increased deployment of regular British soldiers would show that at that stage the British government were recognising that the IRA had developed into quite a formidable foe in the field, and that the column became to epitomise that. So that's all I have to say, and I just hope people found that somewhat useful and found it informative and interesting. So again, thanks to Trasna na Tíre for the opportunity to be here tonight.
That was a fantastic talk. It's really, really interesting. You're going to know how interesting your talk was by the amount of questions we have to ask you. We have plenty of questions. We also have, by the way, people from Argentina, Scotland. We also have Jim Mayer, okay, who wrote the West Kilkenny Flying Column book. And we also have Ned Aylward's son, Dermot, who was in the Flying Column. They're both tuning in tonight and are most welcome.
Excellent.
Brilliant. So I'll just ask you a few questions and we'll see how we get along. Yeah, you mentioned at the start that this was interesting about the origins of the flying columns, but I was doing another lecture with Derek Molyneux, and Liam has asked this too. Would 1916, like the Battle of Ashburn, have been an influence on the flying columns because you'd moving columns there in the battle? Hello? Yeah, have you got me there?
Sorry, Marcus. Sorry, just the link just went there for a second.
Yeah, yeah, no, I was saying 1916, like the Battle of Ashburn,
yes,
or even in Frongok, would that have been an influence on the flying columns also? Or?
Absolutely, yes, indeed, yes, yeah, I think absolutely. I think the experience of the Fingal Battalion and Mulcahy and Ash there, I think, yes, certainly was an influence, and certainly I think the fact that, well, you know, I'm sure that was something. That experience was mulled over in Frongok and other places, and the fact that I think that Mulcahy then went on to be Chief of Staff, he certainly would have been very attuned to the idea of a striking force, and I think it's no coincidence that, you know, probably the only significant victory of the volunteers in Easter week was actually in Ashburn as well. So yeah, certainly I think that would be a key influencer on the idea of the flying column.
Okay, and Marisa McGlinchey has asked, from West Belfast, thanks for the talk, Des. What was the legacy of the flying columns from this period? Like, was the provisional IRA maybe influenced in their guerrilla tactics by the idea of the flying column maybe after the War of Independence?
Yeah, a very good question. I think I alluded there to, we'd say, the 1956 and the launch of Operation Harvest probably in many respects marks that last vestige of that kind of War of Independence structure on the IRA. But yes, in 1969, for instance, and an interesting anecdote of the time is that Tom Barry, approached Daithí O'Connell, for instance, one of the key leaders of the emerging provisional IRA, with the idea of establishing flying columns, again, a bit like reminiscent of 56, along the border areas and maybe reaching further in. And I think O'Connell kind of had to politely say to him that with the advent of the helicopter and so on, that really maintaining an army like that, or a fighting force like that, units in the field, was just not, it just wasn't a runner for the Ireland of 1969-70. But it's interesting, the fact that that kind of dialogue and that idea was there, and the fact that someone like Tom Barry was was still kind of keeping an eye on developments even in that period. But yeah, really that idea of that maintaining an army in the field, I suppose at that stage it had been overtaken by, modern warfare, modern developments and so on. And indeed by the 1970s, the whole IRA structure changed completely and went into kind of more the cell structure and so on. And it moved away from that idea of the brigade and battalion and company. But certainly, yes, there would have been some of the kind of veterans and more the old timers that were still saw it as potentially as having a role to play at that period.
Sure. John has asked, thanks for the talk, Des. Were the columns in West Cork as strong as history leads us to believe? How accurate is the opinion that the columns truly had the Brits on the run?
Yeah, I would think that they were. I think obviously there's like everything else, there's the element of legend and the gaining in the telling and so on. And some would accuse Tom Barry, for instance, of maybe embellishing a little bit here and there. But I think even to peruse any of the studies of the period and any of the academic study, and particularly to go through things like the witness statements, the Bureau of Military History, and the pension statements, certainly West Cork was a very effective area, and there certainly seemed to be quite an effective fighting units there, West Cork, and as I said, North Cork. I think North Cork is often neglected as well in that regard, and I think, as I said, as I alluded to there in the my talk, I think the role played by Liam Lynch is quite significant. And for instance, the capture of Mallow Barracks came about through the effective use of the recently formed flying columns as they were at that time in September 1920. So yeah, I do think that there was an effective IRA structure in both North and West Cork at that period, and I think it had definitely honed its skills through the use of the columns.
Okay. A question from me: did people in the flying columns suffer physically? Because it must have taken a physical toll waiting for hours to tack in the rain in the same clothes. I think Ernie O'Malley mentioned about the itch, like they're all with scratching themselves as well.
Oh, most definitely, and I think that's to be seen even in those that survived, and even the accounts of veterans many years later. There was many died relatively young, died in their in middle early middle age, if you like, many in their 40s and 50s, and many of it attributed to the effects of long nights of sleeping in ditches, of I mean, like the accounts, for instance, of Kilmichael will tell of how those men live effectively on the side of the hill there for something like 12 hours waiting for the auxiliaries to come, and they were sustained by some of the local people who brought them up hot cups of tea and stuff like that. But that was quite a wide experience, yes, and I'm sure it was far from the romantic vision that we often have of the the heroic column disappearing into the hills. There was a reality to that in many cases, that they were sleeping out in the open, they were sleeping in ditches and so on. And as I say, I think the effects of that were long lasting and did come back to affect many of the veterans later on.
Okay. Liam has said, yeah, it's not just the columns. The refrain till today was, if the British don't kill us, the elements will. You mentioned about Tom Barry, and Tom Barry discussed in his book, oh, sorry, I'm skipping a question here from Liam O'Sullivan. Some notable column leaders were ex-British soldiers returning from the trenches of World War I. What impact did his previous military experience have on the effectiveness of the columns?
Oh, I think it certainly had. Obviously, their ability, like I suppose Barry is a prime example of it, his ability to, he obviously already had a kind of a natural leadership, ability, which was innate anyway, but that coupled with his military prowess or his military experience certainly added to it, and it gave him that ability to handle men in the field and under fire. And for instance, like the manner in which he was able to bring his men back under in the immediate aftermath of Kilmichael, when many of them, it was their first time to actually be under fire, and to experience the kind of intense hand fighting that happened there. The men were in bits, and Barry really brought them together, drilled them, because he knew himself that really the real battle was about to begin. They needed to have their wits about them. They needed to be cohesive and disciplined to get out of there. and that's what he did. And yes, I think that certainly was experience. Then again, there was other effective column leaders, people like Sean McKeown, who didn't have that previous experience, but obviously had, a natural military aptitude there, and an aptitude for leadership. People like Tom Maguire, likewise in South Mayo, I think also brought that as well. So I think that's actually a point that I come up with, that, and I think I saw it referenced recently in the RT radio documentary on the War of Independence. I can't remember the particular academic made the point, but I think it's a true one, that in many cases the effectiveness of the column and the effectiveness of the IRA in a given area was very dependent on the leadership capability of the particular OC there. And I think that's reflected across where you had people like a Sean McKeown or a Tom Barry or a Tom Maguire or a Tomás Whalon or whoever it was, you tended to have with it a very effective, fighting force there. So I think there's, the importance of strong leadership in a particular area, the effectiveness or otherwise there, was dependent on that.
That's a great point. You've mentioned something, and I've found this quote of Tom Barry's very, very interesting. Okay, and you mentioned it earlier in your talk, that how the existence of a flying column meant they were succeeding in their goal as being a threat to British forces. Can you explain, in your own opinion, what Tom Barry meant by how important it was to exist as well as to fight?
I actually think I think that's actually one of the most important quotes from Barry in many respects, because it sums up the whole thinking behind the idea of the column, and it probably sums up why the whole thinking behind the whole idea of guerrilla warfare, because exactly that's what it was. It's the very fact that it existed in the field was in itself a statement of resistance to the British government or the British administration or to the status quo. And I suppose in many ways that's a principle that was carried on by, wherever you think of guerrilla warfare having been fought, be it from Vietnam to wherever, the very existence of an effective fighting force, just the fact that they were there meant that the state, the established state, whatever it be the British state, couldn't relax. It couldn't say that it had hegemony of the local area and so on. And the fact that this force was there, and as Barry says, they didn't know when it was going to strike. And so for Barry, and I think other guerrilla leaders, it wasn't so much the idea that, yes, where you struck where you could, but you didn't needlessly endanger yourself, because, if the column was destroyed or forced to disperse or whatever, it was effectively, it was a defeat much more than just a pure military defeat, but it was also in many respects a political defeat as well. And just finally, just on that point, and I think it's something that I picked up in one of the accounts of the columns, and it's an interesting one, was that in many respects they survived because of the lack of arms. They survived basically by the arms that they would capture and the ammunition they would capture. And so that where there was an action where, for instance, maybe they inflicted heavy casualties on British forces, but captured very few arms, or captured very little armaments or whatever from that, that would often be regarded as a defeat, because they would have expended a lot of weaponry, they would have expended a lot of resources in doing that. And yes, okay, they may have inflicted, a number of casualties, but they would be quite negligible to the British Army. But for the IRA, their ability to continue to exist in the field had been depleted by that. So again, I think it feeds into that idea of Barry of the bottom line was to exist, to maintain yourself, and to be and have that ability to strike at all times.
Yeah, nearly like a psychological warfare
yes.
as well. Kevin has asked, what was the hierarchical structure of the flying column? Like, who were they answerable to, or were they independent?
Well, again, that's quite a bit like the columns themselves is quite fluid. But again, it would depend on the area. Like as I alluded to there, and I think Jim Marr in his excellent book, the Flying Column West Kilkenny, kind of makes that point about the West Kilkenny flying column, that in many respects, under the leadership of Ned Aylward, and I'm delighted that his son is with us here tonight, that they had quite a huge amount. They had quite a lot of autonomy, even from the brigade staff, and even from the battalion staff. And I think really some of the people I've just named out there, you know, they were quite strong personalities. They were big local leaders. And in many respects, they were almost like local chieftains. And they had quite an amount of autonomy, even from their local battalion area staff. Now, in some cases, the battalion OC was also the OC of the column and so on. So there was a bit of a crossover there. And I think even less then influence then from, we'll say, even from divisional or GHQ. I think that was quite cursory, really, in many respects. So, yeah, I think it would depend on the area. But I think in many respects, the column had quite a lot of autonomy within its area in choosing its itself and so on. Would make report and so on. But I think in terms of its day-to-day activities, it was down to its own leadership.
Okay. Frank Redmond has said, it's such a shame that this history, especially the role of women, is not taught in schools in the details that you've presented here. From my memory of this 1970s education system, it was glossed over. Thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. And what's interesting as well is, like, Ernie O'Malley's books are The Men Will Talk to Me. Like, what role were the women in the Flying Columns War of Independence period? Did they have much of a role or not?
Oh, I think they had quite a significant role. It's probably one of the weaknesses actually of Ernie O'Malley's and The Men Will Talk to Me was probably it probably gives it away a little bit that he did talk to so few of the women veterans. And again, having said that, that's a criticism of, sometimes level as a criticism of O'Malley, but I think it's also comes out even in the pension records that many of the women, for whatever reason, were not willing to talk so much. But the pension records actually are giving a bit more of a picture into that now, and I think we are getting a fuller view of the kind of activities that they did engage in. And as I kind of briefly mentioned there, their intelligence gathering was vital in many areas, and many of them were in key areas. Some of them worked, say, might be the local postmistress. They would be able to intercept mail from either the RIC barracks or local British barracks. They could maybe tip the local IRA unit off on the movements of British forces and so on. So that was one role in intelligence, which was a vital one. Also, as I talked about there, maintaining the communication links. They would carry dispatches between the column and the brigade or battalion staff. And as I said, also first aid in the field, and there's cases of where actually there was field stations actually set up. I think actually North Cork column was one of the first to do that, where they actually had a field station set up adjacent to one of an ambush that actually escapes me now at the moment. But there was actually, they had a field station set up within a couple of miles of that, so the wounded could be carried there, and there was coming on women there who were proficient in first aid, ready to apply. There was British soldiers brought there as well, and treated there. So that's the kind of work that they engaged in, and they play quite a very active role, and I think a more military role than is often given credit to as well. And I know that, for instance, Sheila Humphreys talked about coming on members receiving training in weapons training and so on as well. So they would do that, and they were proficient in maintaining and carrying the weapons, but they were also trained how to use the weapons as well. So yeah, I think they were quite a key role in maintaining the columns in the field.
Okay, great answer. Liam O'Sullivan has asked, a number of column members joined as they were wanted men and needed to go on the run. Did many members join via this route rather than being the best soldiers, let's say? So, like, would you do it on the run versus?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of both in it. I think there was, I think, because I talked about it there in the talk as well, that, for instance, the law of unintended consequences, that, the passage of the more draconian legislation, for instance, by the British government, the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, for instance, in August 1920, gave them increased powers of arrest. And obviously that forced a lot of men on their own. So regardless of their military proficiency or not, many of them, by default, if you like, fell into full-time roles. But I think it would be true to say that, and I know people like Ernie O'Malley, and that would allude to it, they were, when they were forming a column, the IRA commander would tend to try and select the best, most proficient soldiers, if you like, for that, those that were most efficient. in soldiering for that, for that. So I think there's a little bit of element of both of it. I think there was an element of certain people, kind of falling into that role. But I think it was Ernie O'Malley, I think, made the point that those that weren't cut out for the column life, they tended by attrition, many of them fell away anyway. They found it just wasn't something that they were, physically maybe even able to maintain that kind of life in the field. And that's why, for instance, the age profile of the column would tend to be quite young. The age profile was anything from, say, 18, 19 to kind of early to mid-20s. I know that's largely reflective of that national movement at the time, but particularly for those volunteers on their own, because I think even physically to maintain that kind of lifestyle and to maintain that existence, they would tend to be the younger, more fit and more active volunteers that would do that.
Okay. Colm O'Rourke, who you may know from the 1798 Rebellion Casualty Database, has said, "Hi Des, great talk. Why were the flying columns not as deeply active in Wicklow, Carlow and Wexford compared to Munster and Connacht? I did read in a witness statement, some joked about the Wexford men walking with a limp because of the injuries given to their great-grandfathers during 1798. Colm often mentioned this."
Yeah, it's a very good question, and particularly say for somewhere like Wicklow, which you would imagine was crying out as an area with, in terms of terrain, you would imagine it's a natural guerrilla terrain, and indeed Michael Dwyer, and it could be argued, one of the first kind of active flying columns, if you like, in 1803 in that area. Sean McBride actually is quite interesting on Wicklow, for instance. McBride was sent there by GHQ, I think, in kind of late spring 1921, and he talks in his memoir about going in there and trying to organize, and he found that there was a number of more senior IRA officers that he felt were more reluctant for action, didn't want to kind of bring that kind of unnecessary heat on them, whereas he found there was a younger coterie of volunteers that were more anxious for action. He attempted to set up a number of barrack attacks, because he was saying to them, we need to take the heat off the more active areas and kind of draw them, draw that away. And he did attempt a number of barrack attacks in kind of May, late May into June 1921, with kind of mixed results. And he said a lot of it came from the fact that there had been a relative amount of inactivity prior to that. And he also argued that by one of the reasons he was opposed to the truce in July, he felt it was too early. He felt at that stage that they were beginning to get areas like North Wexford and Wicklow more organised and more on a proper footing. And he'd established at that stage, he was in the stage of getting a column off the ground in Wicklow. And he felt that by that, he felt that summer of 1921 could have been a very hot summer indeed for the British military, because less active areas like that were beginning to become more active. In terms of somewhere like Wexford, again, it's a strange one, because again, Wexford was quite a well organised and had been obviously Enniscorthy in 1916, and there was quite a strong structure there. And yet in the Civil War, it was a very active area. The same applies to my own county in Kildare. In Kildare, I think the presence of the Curragh was a major issue there, and there was a strong British military presence. What's actually emerged about somewhere like Kildare through the Bureau of Military History statements and so on is that there was actually intelligence was quite a strong area. And the passing of military intelligence from Kildare to the more active areas was actually one of the key roles that was played by the IRA brigades in Kildare, so that the troop movements from the Curragh and so on, and that was the kind of intelligence and reconnaissance and so on work that was carried out there. And I think that's an area that needs to be maybe more properly examined. I know there's an excellent study now of the war in Kildare now, just recently been studied, has recently come out. I think it's part of that wider county study of the revolution in the various counties. So I think I think in terms of Wexford, I'll be honest with you, I don't really know why Wexford wasn't as active as it could have been. But I think that I think the testimony of people like Sean McBride does point to the fact that I think those areas were beginning in that late spring period, early summer of 1921. There was a beginning of more activity there, and the development of more columns there in those counties.
Absolutely, absolutely. Leslie O'Hora has got a question to do more with the Civil War. Was it a flying column who would have killed Michael Collins, or would it have been like groups of people who would have been from various flying columns from before?
I'd say it would have been from various areas, because I think there was actually even some, I know I'm open to correction on this.
Yeah.
I think even at that point, because Munster had, the Munster Republic, as it was called, there was still a semblance of conventional warfare going on at that period, between the IRA and the Free State kind of pro-treaty forces. So that, there was quite large brigade and divisional forces still in the field. So I don't know if it was necessarily a column, but there was probably a combination of a number of columns and a number of different battalion and brigade areas there.
I think you're right.
At Ballyblaw,
yeah, because there was Kerry people there as well.
Yeah, because they were maintaining that line from Limerick, I think, across to Waterford, really, at that stage. Yeah.
Absolutely. Patrick Kilfeather has asked, presumably the majority of column movements were on foot. Is there evidence of large-scale use of bicycles or ponies or traps?
There is in some places. Some of the barrack attacks, there was use of pony and traps, and obviously cars were few and far between. But there was, for instance, the attack on Mallow Barracks, and the capture of Mallow Barracks in September 1920 by Liam Lynch and Ernie O'Malley and others. When they were taking the arms from the barracks, they actually had use of a number of cars to do that. So when they'd captured the barracks, they opened the main doors were open, cars were brought in, and the armaments were brought away. And significantly in that situation, what they did with the arms, and they had quite a significant capture of weaponry there, including a Hotchkiss machine gun, which actually gave them an increased firepower. They brought it to a central dump initially, and then Lynch ordered that it be distributed to each of the battalion areas within the brigade, because it was feeding back to the idea of having columns in each of the battalion areas, so that would increase the military capacity of the brigade to a wider area rather than being centered in one area.
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah. Some comments here from Frank Redmond, hello from London. Connor Dwyer, hello from Derry. Sandra Cunningham, thank you from Tipperary. Hello from Mid-Clare. Deirdre Colgan, the one and only, thanks for such an interesting talk. Tim Hoyt, thanks from Rhode Island, USA. You're international between America, Scotland, Argentina. They're all here, Colin. Des, sorry. From Liam, hello from Ballia E. Mercu in Belfast. Matt Siegfried, thank you for organizing this talk. Appreciate the discussion from Ypsilanti, Michigan. Frank McGuigan, thank you, Des. Great talk. Cheers in Belfast. Stephen Coyle, thanks, Des, for a very informative talk, which demonstrates your expert knowledge of Irish Republican history. Have to agree there. Mel McGibbon, thanks for the flying talk. My too, Des. Great to hear from you, Mel. Frank Redmond, are there any books you'd recommend regarding the role of women in this, or even the role of the War of Independence? I see you have a few books there. Liz Gillis's book, I think.
There's certainly been a great improvement in the literature in the last number of years. I suppose people like Sinead McCool, her accounts of the Cumann women. One of the things I do find, and I do think there is a gap. I find many of the Cumann accounts that exist and many of the studies. Now, obviously, Margaret Ward's on Manageable Revolutionaries, and there's a number of others, but many of them tend to focus a lot on the urban experience of Cumann. And I do think that there is a gap there for a study of the role of the Cumann in the columns and in the rural areas. It's probably reflective of the fact that many of those women did not give accounts of their activities and of their time. I do think that's improving, as I said earlier, by the pension records and so on that are coming out. But I do think there's a gap there for that. But at the moment, as I say, the most notable accounts will be those by people like Anne Matthews, as I said, Margaret Ward, Mary McAuliffe has done a lot of excellent work there as well. And there's I think there's a book that just actually come out recently on women in Irish nationalism. I think it's a collection of essays, which again is looking at the role of the women, and particularly Cumann in that period and later. But as I say, I do think for somebody there's a gap there for a study of the women in the field, if you like, those that were active and those that were connected to flying columns and connected to the IRA in rural Ireland. As I say, I think there's quite a lot of studies of coming on in Cork, in Dublin, and so on in the big urban centres. So I think there's definitely an opening there for an academic or a good historian to get their teeth into that.
Absolutely, Des. And to Frank, just for that question to Liz Gillis has a book on the women in the Irish.
Absolutely, Liz. Sorry, apologies, Liz. Absolutely.
Oh, she'd kill me if I didn't mention that. You know, she'd be after me.
Absolutely, yeah, no.
Let's see. Dan, thanks, Des. Very informative. My granduncle would have fought with the West Limerick column in Newcastle West. Con Cregan was his name. And Seamus is from County Derry here. And it's a thank you. Mark O'Brien, great talk. Thank you. Seamus has also said, were the flying columns operational in the 6 counties during the War of Independence?
Well, they were. Well, as I said, now I only briefly kind of touched on it there, but like in Tyrone particularly, Charlie Daly was active there. There was also quite a strong column in Derry, and they were involved in a number of notable engagements there. I think there was one where they actually attacked a British troop train.
Yeah.
Just on the Derry Donegal border, and so there was quite. I think the Ulster and the experience of the columns and the IRA in Ulster is, again, it's improved, and there's certainly I think there's been a lot more focus on it in the last couple of years, but I think there's a lot more to be done there. I think there's certainly I think there's certainly a study to be done on those columns there, and on the activities of the IRA there.
Because Shifra Aiken, I think you have her there as well.
Yes.
Did the Ernie O'Malley book about the Northern Divisions, The Men Will Talk to Me. And my relation was in the 4th Northern Division. And an awful lot of the time, they would do attacks up north from maybe like the border area.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do it in their own area. Do you know what I mean? And it'd be tit for tat over and back from the borders. It's interesting to look at. Margaret Furlong, why do you call it guerrilla warfare? Why is the term guerrilla warfare used?
Well, I think that was the nature of what was happening if I'm answering the question correctly, that was the nature of the warfare that they were engaging in. It was, there was I think a lesson taken from 1916 was that, a volunteer army was not going to be in a position to take on a conventional army in the field, and the only way to do it was to rely on its strengths, which were its knowledge of the terrain, the knowledge of the area, and to strike and retreat, and go back to what Barry's idea was, to exist, to be there.
Okay, we should be done in about 5 minutes. Just the questions are rolling in here. Okay, so Sarah, I think it was Tim Pat Coogan who wrote that Tom McEllistrom in Kerry was every bit as important as some of the other better known luminaries like Tom Barry, but more reserved. Is this true?
Probably, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And apologies, there's so many you could mention, and certainly Tom McEllistrom would have been among those. I suppose it's often said about Barry that apart from his military prowess, he was also very good at the PR, and that's true as well. I mean, I suppose the fact that Barry wrote so well, and really was an excellent writer, and his book obviously became a seminal tome. So it obviously put him up there, apart from the fact, in fairness to Barry as well, and he's often to cry, but he was an effective soldier as well. But yeah, certainly there's so many that you could name. As I said, people like Tom McEllistrom in Kerry. I think I think again that's improved. I think there's certainly been more a study of Kerry, because often Kerry, in its terms of its activities in the War of Independence, tends to be overlooked in terms of the Civil War. Absolutely. I think a lot of the focus is on that. Then in the West, obviously, I talked about people like Tom Maguire there. Michael Kilroy was a very effective guerrilla leader in the West. Liam Pilkington in the Sligo area, again, was someone else that was, another effective person at the time. Tom Brady in Longford, who I mentioned briefly, I think again is one of those figures that's largely overlooked, and the activities of the IRA in North Longford were very effective. He's often eclipsed actually to a degree by Sean McKeown, but it's often forgotten that when McKeown was imprisoned, that the activities of the IRA did not deplete, and that was largely due to the role of people like Tom Brady. So yeah, there's a lot of unsung people out there that there could be an awful lot more talked about and written about.
I think that's a very interesting point that you've made, because an awful lot of historians will know their own county, but you've got a general knowledge of flying columns all over Ireland, and I think people should read other counties that aren't their own county.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like some of the battles and some of the things they had to go through. I mean, it's incredible stories from other counties that you mightn't be as familiar with. Where did they get the arms and ammunition for these flying columns?
The bulk of it came from, as I was talking about earlier, the bulk of it came from captured weaponry, so they would be very dependent on, that's why they were so focused, and John Borgonovo makes that point, that in many respects, the fact that they were so poorly armed made them much more focused and disciplined about where they would fight and how they would fight, so that, as I said earlier, if they engage in a military engagement and it resulted in maybe heavy British casualties, but a small amount of weaponry being captured, the IRA would often regard that as rather a defeat, because they had depleted their own meagre resources with nothing to gain. So yeah, they were dependent on those barrack attacks, maybe capturing a barracks, capturing the weaponry and ammunition that was there. And you would find that many of the support people that were maybe cutting down trees and blocking roads and so on, many of them would be armed with shotguns, and many of them not armed at all. We're making a point there that the experience of the flying column volunteer was atypical. Many veterans of the Tan War period, many of them went through that entire conflict without maybe barely handling a weapon in that whole period, because weapons were so few and far between, and it was really those that were really in the front line, literally, to borrow that phrase, that would actually handle the few weapons that were there. And it was, so when you'd see the image of the flying column member with the Lee Enfield rifle, it was very few that got to handle a Lee Enfield rifle.
Absolutely. Lima said, Garamaigo Des, Deirdre Colgan said, thank you, Des, for all the information, very interesting. Mel has also said, local knowledge and intelligence gathering must have been key in successful operations of the columns. And Margaret Furlong has said, thank you so much, all of you, very interesting. Thanks very much. Dominic Price, who's written an excellent book on Mayo, actually.
Yes.
Well done, Des. Fantastic talk.
Thanks, Dominic.
Marianne Mayer, another excellent historian. Great talk, Des. Thanks. It's interesting when I looked at the military archives and inputted my own area, Ballingarry, South Tipperary, you only find about 10 records, but yet doing research mostly through local newspapers have collected about 40 names, both men and women, who were or claim to be involved in the War of Independence. Rob Duggan, another great historian, good comments and insights, sorry. Thanks. Their bravery and sacrifice leaves us with an august duty to maintain our freedom from the new enemies of our generation. Vincent laid in, had a class, hope to catch a video maybe. This will be up on YouTube tomorrow. And he's also mentioned about women affected in the War of Independence, Civil War on TG4 tonight. Kelleheck, you got 100 in despite that, by the way. We've had a packed out house tonight, Des. Thanks from Bandon. Thanks, Des, from Aileen. Thanks all. Thanks, Des, Marcus. Deirdre Colgan, lovely to see you, Marcus. Thank you, Deirdre. Michael Maroney, Guramaigot, Des, for a very interesting, informative talk. Kevin, Guramaigot, Des. Liz is a new project, says Deirdre Colgan. How successful were the flying columns at the time of the truce? Did De Valera consider the flying columns on whether to accept a truce? Why accept a truce when obviously Britain were very rattled by the flying columns?
Yeah, well, again, division or opinion is kind of divided. There was some, and in many respects, it often comes down to people's attitude to the treaty. Sometimes reflects it. It was argued, obviously, by Collins and others, that the IRA really at that stage was on the back foot, and that, resource-wise, in terms of its arms and so on, that it wasn't in a position to continue on. On the other side of that, people like Liam Lynch, Ernie O'Malley, likewise, respectively in the 1st and 2nd Southern Division areas, people like Sean McBride, who, as I said, had been delegated by GHQ staff to travel out to less active areas and reactivate them. They were vehement in their view that the truce shouldn't have come when it came. They felt that at that point they were beginning to turn the corner in many respects, that the momentum was actually far from slowing, it was actually building. and that, as I said earlier on, the less active areas were beginning to be activated, and columns, the whole idea of columns and so on, and full-time active service units, that idea was spreading out. So in many respects, they, you know, depending on looking at the evidence that's there, I certainly tend to think that that summer of 1921 could potentially, as McBride said, could have been quite a hot summer for the British military, because I think there was certainly a momentum building, and at that point, the British administration had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the vast majority of the people throughout the country as well, and the Dáil at that stage had gained control over all the local authority areas, and I think the burning of the Custom House also had dealt a major blow. I think that's one that's not looked at. It's often looked at, yes, militarily the IRA took a lot of casualties, and it was actually at the behest of De Valera, for instance, that he wanted at that point on his return from America, he wanted to see a lot more kind of conventional actions, because he was looking at it as a propaganda war as well as going back to the whole idea of legitimacy. And I know that there was a number felt that it had seriously depleted the Dublin Brigade by the losses that were taken there. But as an action, and as a propaganda action, it has a huge effect. And also, on a practical level, it had kind of blinded the British civil administration in Ireland as well. So, and its revenue-raising powers and so on. So it was certainly, and that period of July 1921, I would argue that the national movement, if you want to put it that way, of the Dáil and its army were in quite a strong position.
Okay. Guru Mai Des on Samuel Mel McGibbon, as ever well, Marshal Marcus, thank you. My grandfather Jimmy Gibbons ran guns from across England to West Mayo Brigade. Dominic Price has said about guerrilla warfare, guerra is a Spanish language for war, so guerrillas means warriors. From Sarah, thank you for answering my question. Kerry Abu, there's a great book, again, the Liz Gillis book is mentioned there. Liam Sullivan, well done, Des and Marcus, and to all the contributors who asked questions. This was one of the best Q&A of the series so far. Kerry Abu too. Deirdre Colligan, thanks Dominic. Stackland, thank you, I'm enjoying this. My grandmother was one of those rural women living close to the Kathmandu hideout and supporting some of those who came to bed then overnight and other reasons. Tom Leary, thanks very much for sharing your extensive knowledge. Well done. Frank Redmond, thank you for book. It's Sue Redmond under her husband's account. Thank you for the book recommendations and thanks. Dermot Aylworth, well done. Des and Marcus. Deirdre Colgan has mentioned about the show. Sean Carey, thanks from Athlone, not Argentina. There was a typo. Well, we have Boston. We have William.
Well,
Boston.
there's quite a Westmeath contingent seemingly in Argentina, so you never know. There might be connections there.
I thought it was Diego Maradona. William Forsyth, thanks from Boston. Carol said Kildare Irish Revolution book is by Seamus Cullen. Thanks for the talk.
Seamus Cullen, yes.
Was Liam Tobin part of the flying columns with Patrick Clancy, or not?
No, I think Liam Tobin was based primarily in Dublin. He was part of the famous Collins squad and so on. So he was kind of more primarily involved in the intelligence war.
Okay. Colin O'Rourke has said it's a fantastic talk. Thanks, Des, and thanks, Marcus, for hosting. Sean Kenny, outstanding talk, gentlemen. Cheers from Virginia. And Guru Mayagut from Sarah from Canada. So we are international. We mightn't have Argentina. We do have Athlone with Canada.
Across the Atlantic anyway, yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, Des, that was incredible talk you gave. Great questions and answers at the end as well. I think it's so important, though, people do look outside their own county to understand all these heroic stories that there are. And even sadness and tragedy too from the various counties, because we have such a rich history, and it's so great that you have got such a general knowledge of all the counties, or a lot of the counties. I know you won't know it all, but I mean you've most of it. You know, in terms of the talk, it was illuminating talk. You can see from the comments tonight, you rocked it, as they say.
Just before we finish, Marcus, and I say I also feel privileged that I'm of a generation that just about managed to make a connection with some of the veterans. You know, I was of an age where I managed to meet, like for instance, a man called Miles Riley, who was the last survivor of the Neil Plunkett O'Boyle column that operated in Wicklow during the Civil War that I mentioned there. Like I met Miles on a number of occasions in his latter years. And, you know, another old veteran I remember meeting who actually remember Sean McBride. He was another Wicklow veteran, and he remembers Sean McBride coming down to take them on training camps and so on, and in that period of the truce in July 21 and so on. So I often feel privileged that, as I say, I have a passion and always had a passion for that particular, all Republican history, but particularly for that particular period, and the Civil War period. And I always feel privileged that I managed to live in a time when a number of those veterans were still alive, and I managed to meet them, because I think they're an amazing generation of people. I think they were absolutely, you know, I think of that generation of the 1913-23 period, you know, what they did and the odds that they faced and the conditions that they were living in. It's amazing what they did achieve, and I think we all owe them so much.
I think very well said, and I'll be very proud to know you're a keeper of that flame in terms of keeping their story alive. Thanks a million, Des. Really appreciate it. And you would have gotten an outstanding round of applause on Zoom. All right, take care.
Thank you, Marcus. Go on, everybody.